Dust choked the air the day Margaret Dawson stood before the town council and bet her family's 100-year legacy on a single, fragile seed. Neighbors snickered behind calloused hands. Seasoned farmers called her delusional. They saw a desperate young woman trying to grow weeds in a graveyard of dead corn. Nobody knew those bright yellow petals were hiding a secret that would expose a multi-million-dollar corporate sabotage, bankrupt a local tyrant, and resurrect a dying town. This is a true story of dirt, debt, and the ultimate revenge. The drought of 2024 hadn't just dried up the soil in Oak Haven, Kansas. It had baked the hope right out of the people. On the Dawson farm, the earth had turned into a concrete slab of cracked brown despair. Generations of continuous corn and wheat planting, compounded by brutal chemical fertilizers, had left the ground biologically dead. When the rain stopped, the dirt turned to powder, blowing away in the relentless prairie wind. Warren Dawson sat at the worn oak kitchen table, his hands trembling as he stared at a stack of final notices from the Oak Haven Agricultural Bank. His knuckles were permanently stained with grease and topsoil, a testament to 40 years of back-breaking labor that was now evaporating before his eyes. The farm was $2 million in the red. Foreclosure wasn't just a threat. It was a scheduled event, slated for the end of the next harvest season. Across from him sat his daughter, Margaret. Margaret hadn't stayed in Oak Haven to marry a local boy and settle into the quiet, rural life. She had spent the last 6 years at the state university, earning a master's degree in agronomy and soil science, much to the quiet disapproval of the traditional farming community. "Dad, you can't plant corn again," Margaret said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The hardpan is 3 feet thick. Corn roots can't penetrate it. Even if we get rain, it'll just run off. You're throwing good seed into a grave." Warren sighed, a ragged sound that rattled in his dust-filled lungs. "Corn is what we know, Maggie. Corn is what the crop insurance covers. Corn is what Gregory Fisk at the bank expects to see on the ledger." Gregory Fisk is an idiot in a cheap suit who wouldn't know a nitrogen cycle if it bit him. Margaret shot back, slamming her hands on the table. She unrolled a massive topological map of their property, covered in red and blue overlays. "I've taken core samples from the Broken 60, the worst plot we have. It's completely compacted, devoid of microbial life. But deep down, below the hardpan, there's residual moisture. We just need a biological drill to get to it." "A biological drill?" Warren asked, his brow furrowing. "Sunflowers," Margaret declared. Silence hung heavy in the farmhouse kitchen, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Sunflowers," Warren repeated, deadpan. "You want to save a multi-million-dollar commercial farming operation with a giant flower. Not just any sunflower, Dad. A specific, deep-rooted commercial oilseed hybrid, Helianthus annuus. Their taproots are aggressive. They can punch through compacted soil like a jackhammer, breaking up the hardpan. They scavenge for deep water and nutrients that corn can't reach, and when they die, those massive roots decompose, leaving channels for water to infiltrate next year. It's called phytoremediation." Warren rubbed his temples. "Maggie, they'll laugh us out of the county. Sunflowers are for birdseed and hippie gardens." The real test came the next morning at the Oak Haven Diner, the unofficial headquarters of local farm gossip. Margaret and Warren walked in to grab coffee before heading to the bank. The diner was thick with the smell of bacon grease and impending failure. Sitting in the corner booth was Jackson Carlos. Carlos wasn't a farmer. He was an agribusiness CEO who had been buying up bankrupt family farms for pennies on the dollar, consolidating them into a massive, soulless corporate conglomerate. He had his eyes on the Dawson land because it connected his 2 largest tracts. "Well, if it isn't the Dawsons," Carlos boomed, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. "Warren, I hear Fisk is breathing down your neck. My offer still stands. $200,000 for the whole spread. You can pay off a fraction of your debt and walk away with your shirts." Margaret stepped in front of her father. "The Dawson farm isn't for sale, Jackson," Carlos sneered, looking Margaret up and down. "And what's the grand plan, little girl? Going to plant magic beans?" "Sunflowers," Margaret said loudly, ensuring the entire diner heard her. 50 acres of commercial sunflowers on the Broken 60. The diner went dead silent. Then, Bobby Jenkins, the feed store manager, snorted. A second later, the entire room erupted into roaring laughter. Men slapped their knees. Coffee spilled on the linoleum. "Sunflowers," Carlos wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "You're going to fight off a $2 million foreclosure with a bouquet, Warren. Get your daughter under control before she bankrupts you faster than the drought. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she locked eyes with Carlos. Laugh all you want, Jackson, but when my roots break the soil you couldn't. I don't want to see you crying. She grabbed her father's arm and marched out of the diner. The battle lines were drawn. Margaret wasn't just fighting the weather or the bank anymore. She was fighting an entire culture of stubbornness. Warren, defeated by the town's mockery but too exhausted to fight his daughter, compromised. He gave Margaret the broken 60, a 60-acre plot of the most degraded, rock-hard soil on the property. It was land that hadn't yielded a profitable crop in a decade. If she wanted to prove a point, she would have to do it in the dirtiest, toughest arena possible. Margaret drained her entire savings account, $12,000, to buy the specialized oilseed sunflower seeds, inoculants, and the necessary modifications for their ancient John Deere planter. When she pulled her rusted pickup truck into Jenkins Feed and Seed to collect her order, Bobby Jenkins leaned over the counter, a smirk plastered on his face. "Got your bird feed right here, Maggie," Bobby chuckled, sliding the heavy bags across the loading dock. "You gonna put up a scarecrow? Or just let the crows eat the bank's collateral directly?" "Just load the bags, Bobby," Margaret said, her jaw clenched tight. Planting the broken 60 was a grueling, bone-rattling nightmare. The ground was so compacted that the planter's discs bounced off the surface, sparking against hidden rocks. Margaret had to add iron weights to the planter just to force the blades into the dead earth. She drove the tractor for 3 days straight, breathing in plumes of choking dust, her hands blistered and bleeding from the steering wheel. She planted the seeds deeper than standard protocol, burying them where the soil temperature was cooler, gambling that the hybrid genetics would trigger aggressive downward growth. Then, the agonizing wait began. For 2 weeks, the Kansas sun beat down on the broken 60 like a hammer. The local teenagers started driving by the Dawson farm at night, throwing empty beer cans into the dirt and yelling, "How's the garden growing, Maggie?" Jackson Carlos even parked his gleaming new truck on the county road parallel to the field, making a show of inspecting the barren dirt through binoculars and laughing with his foreman. But the real crisis wasn't the mockery. It was the water. Margaret had calculated that the sunflowers needed 1 deep, soaking irrigation to trigger the initial taproot dive. The farm had a limited allotment from the local reservoir, managed by a series of sluice gates and main lines. On the night she planned to open the valves for the broken 60, she drove her four-wheeler out to the main pump house. She turned the massive iron wheel to open the valve. Nothing happened. Frowning, she grabbed a heavy wrench and tapped the pipes. Hollow. She grabbed her flashlight and traced the main PVC line down into the dry creek bed. What she found made her blood run cold. The heavy-duty mainline pipe hadn't just burst. It had been cleanly severed. A 2-foot section was entirely missing, cut away with a hacksaw. The water she desperately needed was draining uselessly into the alkaline mud of the creek miles away from her field. Margaret dropped to her knees in the dust. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. She thought immediately of Jackson Carlos. Without water, her seeds would bake in the ground. The foreclosure would proceed, and Carlos would swoop in to buy the land. She had no proof, no witnesses, and the sheriff, a man whose re-election campaign was heavily funded by Carlos, would do nothing. Returning to the farmhouse, Margaret found her father asleep in his armchair, an empty glass of whiskey by his side, his face gray with stress. She couldn't tell him. It would break what little spirit he had left. Margaret spent the next 48 hours in a state of manic desperation. She rented a massive, 5,000-gallon water tender truck on a high-interest credit card. She drove back and forth to the municipal fill station in town, paying commercial rates for water, and drove it directly onto the broken 60. It was agonizingly slow. She drove the truck in first gear, manually spraying the water over the rows using a jury-rigged boom sprayer. She didn't sleep. She survived on black coffee and sheer, unadulterated rage. By the time she finished, she had spent her last dime. The seeds were watered, but the surface moisture evaporated quickly under the harsh sun. Now, the seeds had to do what they were bred to do: dig deep or die. 10 days later, a miracle happened. Margaret was out on the field at dawn, kicking at the dirt with the toe of her boot. She stopped. There, pushing bravely through a crack in the crusty brown earth, was a tiny, pale green cotyledon. She dropped to her knees, brushing the dirt away. Further down the row, another sprout, and another. The broken 60 was germinating. Within weeks, the field transformed. The tiny sprouts grew into sturdy stalks, But what was happening below the surface was the true marvel. Margaret carefully dug a trench next to one of the plants to inspect the root system. The taproot was as thick as her thumb and was driving straight downward like a spear. It had hit the compacted hardpan, the layer of soil that had killed her father's corn, and instead of turning sideways and giving up, it bored right through it. The sunflowers were shattering the impenetrable barrier, reaching the hidden, trapped moisture deep in the subsoil. But agriculture is a cruel master. And just as the field turned a vibrant, defiant green, the weather threw a devastating curveball. It was late May, a time when the prairie usually settled into a warm groove. However, the meteorologists on the local news began panicking about a freak, late-season Arctic front sweeping down from Canada. A hard freeze was predicted for 2 consecutive nights. Sunflowers, especially young ones, are incredibly susceptible to frost. A hard freeze would turn the cellular structure of the plants to mush. Margaret's entire gamble was about to be wiped out by ice. Warren stood on the back porch, watching the temperature drop. "It's over, Maggie," he said, his voice hollow. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. We can't fight a freeze. I am not letting this crop die," Margaret snapped, her eyes wild. "Dad, where are the old smudge pots? The ones Grandpa used for the peach orchard in the 70s? Warren blinked. "They're in the back of the rusted pole barn. Haven't been used in 30 years. But Maggie, there's only about 50 of them, and we don't have enough diesel. We have old tractor oil. We have kerosene. We have damp straw," Margaret commanded. "Get the truck. Now." For the second time that season, Margaret waged war against nature. As the sun set and the temperature plummeted toward 30 degrees, she and Warren dragged heavy, rusted iron smudge pots out to the broken 60. They placed them strategically upwind of the crop. They filled them with a toxic, smoky mixture of waste oil, diesel, and wet straw. At midnight, as the frost began to crystallize on the tractor hood, Margaret lit the pots. Thick, black, insulating smoke billowed across the field, trapping the ambient heat radiating from the earth and creating a heavy artificial blanket over the young sunflowers. Margaret ran from pot to pot all night, coughing violently, her face stained black with soot, feeding the fires. She burned old tires, broken pallets, anything she could find to keep the smoke thick. When the sun finally rose, the air was bitter cold, and the neighboring fields were covered in a devastating white frost. Margaret collapsed by the fence line, exhausted to her bones. As the wind shifted and the black smoke cleared, she looked out over the broken 60. The sunflowers were pristine. The smoke blanket had saved them. Warren walked up beside her, smelling of kerosene and sweat. He looked at the surviving green field, then down at his daughter. For the first time in years, the defeated slump in his shoulders was gone. "You're a stubborn fool, Maggie," he whispered, a smile cracking his weathered face. "Just like your grandfather." By mid-July, the broken 60 was no longer a joke. It was a spectacle. The stalks had surged to 6 feet tall, thick and robust. And then they bloomed. 60 acres of massive, brilliant golden heads, all turned uniformly toward the rising sun. It was a breathtaking sea of yellow amidst a county of dying, stunted green corn. The local papers came out to take pictures. Even the teenagers who had thrown beer cans stopped to stare in awe. The deep taproots had not only survived, they had pulled up dormant nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that had been leached deep into the soil over decades, bringing them back into the plant's biomass. Margaret wasn't just growing a cash crop, she was repairing the earth. But as the golden field drew awe from the town, it drew pure, venomous fury from Jackson Carlos. Carlos realized that if Margaret successfully harvested this crop, the specialty oilseed market prices would easily cover the Dawsons' overdue bank payments. Worse, if she proved that the hard pan could be broken biologically, his narrative that the land was worthless without his expensive, proprietary deep-tilling machinery would collapse. One afternoon, a sleek black town car pulled into the Dawson driveway. It wasn't Carlos. It was Gregory Fisk, the bank manager, clutching a leather briefcase. Margaret and Warren met him on the porch. "Beautiful flowers, Warren," Fisk said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Truly a picturesque hobby. However, I'm here on official business." Fisk opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. "The bank's board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning. Upon review of your account, we've determined that planting a non-insured, high-risk crop violates the terms of your operational loan covenant. We are calling the loan in full. You have 30 days to produce $2 million, or the bank seizes Oakhaven Farm immediately. Margaret stared at the papers. 30 days. The sunflowers wouldn't be ready for harvest for another 6 weeks. They had survived the drought, the sabotage, and the freeze, only to be killed by a stroke of a banker's pen. And as Fiske drove away, Margaret noticed the license plate frame on his expensive car. It was a corporate gift, bearing the logo of Jackson Carlos's agribusiness empire. The game had just changed. Paperwork became Margaret's new war zone, while the golden heads of the sunflowers tracked the relentless Kansas sun outside. The interior of the Dawson farmhouse was buried in a blizzard of legal documents, loan covenants, and decades-old property deeds. Margaret had exactly 30 days to find a shield against the bank's executioner, Gregory Fisk. She spent 3 sleepless nights poring over the fine print of the agricultural loan. Fisk's entire premise rested on Clause 4B, the planting of a non-insured, high-risk cash crop. Because the sunflowers weren't traditional corn or wheat, and because they hadn't been pre-approved by the federal crop insurance adjusters, Fisk claimed the bank's collateral was endangered. But Margaret wasn't just a farmer. She was an agronomist who knew the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Department of Agriculture intimately. At 3 a.m. on the 4th night, fueled by cold, bitter espresso, her eyes locked onto a faded addendum from a 1,985 Farm Bill restructuring. "Dad," Margaret shouted, her voice echoing through the quiet, dusty house. "Dad, wake up." Warren stumbled down the wooden stairs, clutching a frayed bathrobe around his shoulders. "What is it, Maggie? Did a coyote get into the barn?" "Better," Margaret said, her eyes blazing with a feral, triumphant light. She slammed a heavy index finger onto the densely typed page. "Look at this. The bank didn't just give Grandpa a standard loan in '85. They enrolled this farm in the Federal Soil Conservation and Remediation Act to get a lower interest rate." Warren squinted, putting on his reading glasses. "I remember something about that. We had to plant windbreaks. But what does that have to do with Fisk?" "Everything," Margaret breathed. Under the Conservation Act, any active effort to biologically remediate dead or compacted soil isn't classified as a cash crop at all. It's legally defined as an environmental intervention strategy. They can't call the loan on a high-risk crop because, legally speaking, I'm not growing a crop. I'm conducting a federally protected soil rescue operation. Fisk's foreclosure notice is completely invalid. He didn't do his homework. Relief washed over Warren's weathered face, but it was quickly replaced by a dark, gnawing confusion. "But Maggie, how did Fisk know exactly what seed variety you planted? How did he know it wasn't insured? The only people who knew the exact hybrid genetics were you, me, and the seed distributor." Margaret's triumphant smile vanished. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. She thought back to the severed water line in the creek bed. She thought of Jackson Carlos's smug face, and then a sickening realization began to coil in her stomach. There was a 4th person who knew, Warren's younger brother, Leonard. Uncle Leonard owned a small, struggling cattle operation 5 miles down the county road. He had been a constant, quiet presence at the farmhouse over the last few months, ostensibly checking in on his older brother's failing health. He had been sitting right at this kitchen table when Margaret unboxed the invoices from the seed company. He knew the layout of the water lines perfectly. "Dad," Margaret asked, her voice dangerously calm, "where does Uncle Leonard get the financing for his cattle feed?" Warren frowned. "He's been struggling. Said he found a private backer last winter to float his operational costs." "Why?" "Because I think his private backer is Jackson Carlos," Margaret said. To prove it, Margaret set a trap. The next afternoon, when Leonard stopped by for his usual cup of black coffee, Margaret made a show of looking stressed. "It's a nightmare. Uncle Leonard," she sighed, wiping grease from her hands. "The bank is on our necks. The only thing keeping those sunflowers alive right now is the secondary backup well pump on the North Ridge. If that pump fails before the injunction goes through, the crop will dry up in a week." There was no backup well pump on the North Ridge. It was a rusted, defunct piece of machinery that hadn't been connected to power since 1998. Leonard's eyes darted toward the window, masking a sudden flicker of intense interest. "That's a shame, Maggie. A real shame. You know, you should just take Carlos's buyout, save your father the heart attack." That night, Margaret parked her pickup truck behind a dense thicket of Osage orange trees near the North Ridge. Armed with a high-powered flashlight and a digital camera, she waited for 4 agonizing hours in the biting chill of the prairie night. At 1 a.m., Headlights cut through the darkness. A heavy-duty flatbed truck rolled to a stop near the rusted pump house. A figure stepped out, carrying a heavy steel pry bar. Margaret zoomed in the camera lens and hit record. It was Leonard. She watched, her heart breaking into jagged pieces, as her own uncle wedged the pry bar into the casing of the defunct pump, grunting as he tried to shatter the housing. He was trying to deliver the final killing blow to his own brother's legacy. Margaret stepped out of the brush, clicking on the massive, blinding beam of the flashlight, pinning Leonard in the stark white light. "It's dead, Leonard." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip across the silent ridge. "Just like your soul." Leonard dropped the pry bar with a loud clang, shielding his eyes, his face pale with terror and guilt. "Maggie, you don't understand," Leonard stammered, backing away. "Carlos, he held my mortgage. He said if I didn't help him force Warren out, he'd take my house. He'd take my herd. I didn't have a choice. You cut the water line to the broken 60. Margaret stepped closer, her anger vibrating through the beam of light. "You sold out your own blood to a corporate vulture so you could save your own skin." "I was trying to help," Leonard pleaded, tears cutting through the dirt on his cheeks. "Warren is drowning. Carlos's money is the only way out. Get off this farm," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "If I ever see you on Dawson land again, I won't call the sheriff. I'll bury you under the hardpan." Leonard scrambled into his truck and sped away into the night, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Margaret had her evidence. She knew exactly who her enemies were, and the war was about to escalate. Armed with the video of Leonard's sabotage, a sworn affidavit regarding the severed water line, and the 1985 Federal Soil Conservation Act loophole, Margaret walked into the county courthouse the next morning and filed an emergency injunction against the Oak Haven Agricultural Bank. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman named Harper who had grown up on a dairy farm, reviewed the paperwork with narrowed eyes. When Gregory Fisk and his expensive corporate lawyer arrived, looking smug and polished, Judge Harper didn't mince words. "Mr. Fisk," Judge Harper said, leaning over the mahogany bench, "Miss Dawson has presented compelling evidence that your foreclosure attempt is not only in violation of federal conservation statutes, but may be part of a coordinated campaign of intimidation and property damage linked to Jackson Carlos's agribusiness. I am granting a temporary restraining order against the bank. You are forbidden from seizing the Dawson farm until the Federal Agricultural Board can review the soil remediation status." Case dismissed. Margaret walked out of the courthouse feeling a surge of adrenaline. She had bought them time. The harvest was protected. But Jackson Carlos was not a man who accepted defeat in a courtroom. If he couldn't take the farm legally, he would destroy the prize directly. A week before the sunflowers reached peak maturity, the winds over the Kansas plains shifted, blowing hard from the west. West of the Dawson farm was a massive 3,000-acre tract of genetically modified soybeans owned by Carlos Agribusiness. Margaret was in the barn, calibrating the combine harvester, when the low, mechanical drone of an airplane engine vibrated through the corrugated tin roof. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the glare. A bright yellow crop duster biplane was flying dangerously low over Carlos's soybean fields. But it wasn't flying in a standard grid. It was hugging the property line, flying directly upwind of the broken 60, and beneath its wings, thick, heavy plumes of chemical spray were billowing out into the howling wind. Margaret's blood ran cold. Dicamba. It was a highly volatile, highly toxic broadleaf herbicide. Carlos's genetically modified soybeans were immune to it, but sunflowers were hypersensitive broadleaf plants. Even a microscopic amount of dicamba drift riding the wind would cause the sunflower stalks to curl, blister, and die within days. Spraying a volatile chemical in 30-mile-per-hour winds directly adjacent to a neighboring farm was wildly illegal, a blatant violation of Environmental Protection Agency regulations. Carlos was trying to gas her crop. "Dad!" Margaret screamed over the roar of the engine. "Get the drone, now!" Warren came running out of the farmhouse, clutching the small, high-definition quadcopter they used for aerial crop scouting. Margaret snatched the controller from his hands, her fingers flying over the joysticks. The small drone buzzed into the air, fighting the heavy wind. She flew it straight toward the property line, directly into the path of the yellow biplane. The camera fed a live, high-resolution feed to the screen in her hands. She recorded the registration numbers on the tail of the plane. She recorded the active nozzles spraying the chemical mist. And, Most importantly, she recorded the heavy wind carrying the toxic cloud directly over the fence line and onto the first few rows of her golden sunflowers. The pilot of the crop duster suddenly spotted the drone hovering in his flight path. Realizing he was being recorded committing a federal environmental crime, he panicked. He banked the plane violently to the left, pulling up in a steep, desperate climb. The sudden maneuver cut off the spray valves, but it was a close call. The plane roared off toward the horizon, leaving a lingering, sour chemical smell in the air. Margaret landed the drone, her hands shaking with rage. The first 2 rows of the sunflowers had been hit by the drifting mist. Over the next few days, she watched in agony as the leaves on those westernmost rows cupped, twisted, and withered into blackened husks. But Carlos had miscalculated. He had underestimated the sheer, aggressive vitality of the Helianthus annuus taproots. The sunflowers had spent the entire summer pulling deep, rich nutrients and water from the fractured hardpan. They were incredibly robust, while the outer 2 rows acted as a sacrificial shield, absorbing the brunt of the toxic drift. The remaining 58 acres stood tall and defiant. The dense canopy of the surviving plants blocked the wind, saving the heart of the field. Furthermore, Margaret now had a weapon far more destructive than herbicide. She had irrefutable, high-definition video evidence of Carlos' agribusiness intentionally violating federal EPA spray regulations. She didn't just go to the local sheriff this time. She sent the video file directly to the regional director of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Kansas Department of Agriculture, along with a detailed report of the wind speeds and the chemical burn damage. 2 days later, a fleet of black, government-issued SUVs rolled past the Dawson farm and turned into the heavily gated entrance of Carlos' agribusiness headquarters. Jackson Carlos's empire was suddenly the subject of a massive, multi-agency federal investigation. His accounts were frozen, his spray licenses were revoked, and he was facing millions of dollars in federal fines. The corporate tyrant of Oakhaven had been brought to his knees by a camera drone and a patch of yellow flowers. Late September arrived, bringing a crisp, cool edge to the prairie air. The golden petals of the sunflowers began to dry and fall away, leaving behind massive, heavy heads bowed toward the earth, packed tight with thousands of oil-rich seeds. It was harvest day. The town of Oakhaven, which had mocked Margaret so mercilessly in the spring, now lined the edges of the county road in hushed, reverent silence. They leaned against the hoods of their pickup trucks, watching as Margaret climbed into the cab of the massive, green John Deere combine. She engaged the threshing cylinder. The massive diesel engine roared to life, a sound of pure, mechanical triumph. Margaret steered the massive machine into the first row of the broken 60. The specialized sunflower header, with its long protruding catchpans, guided the thick stalks into the cutting blades. The machine swallowed the giant flower heads, chopping the stalks and spitting the shredded organic matter out the back, while the precious black seeds were violently separated and funneled up into the grain tank behind the cab. It was a slow, majestic process. The dust that rose behind the combine wasn't the dead, powdery dirt of a ruined farm. It was the rich, organic dust of a successful harvest. Warren stood at the edge of the field, tears openly streaming down his face. He watched his daughter, the girl who refused to give up, single-handedly pulling their family's salvation from the ground. When the grain tank of the combine was full, Margaret drove over to the waiting semi-truck trailer and extended the auger arm. A thick, roaring waterfall of black sunflower seeds poured into the trailer. The sheer volume was staggering. The phytoremediation had worked beyond her wildest models. The aggressive taproots had fractured the hardpan so completely that the plants had accessed virgin, untapped nutrient reserves deep in the earth. The yield wasn't just good, it was record-breaking. They were pulling in over 2,000 pounds of seed per acre. But volume was only half the battle. The true victory came a week later, when the test results from the grain elevator arrived. Margaret had negotiated a tentative contract with a boutique, organic culinary oil company based in California. They were looking for high oleic, sustainably farmed sunflower oil, and they were willing to pay a massive premium. The buyer's representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Sarah, stood in the Dawson driveway, holding the laboratory assay of the harvested seeds. "Margaret," the representative said, her eyes wide with astonishment. "I've been in the oilseed purchasing business for 15 years. I have never seen an oil profile like this. The oleic acid content is off the charts. The seeds are incredibly dense, completely free of the usual heavy metal contaminants we see in standard commercial plots. It's the deep subsoil," Margaret explained proudly. The roots bypassed the exhausted topsoil and tapped into clean, deep reserves. The stress of the hard pan actually forced the plants to produce a higher concentration of oil. Well, the representative smiled, extending a hand. We want exclusivity, and we are prepared to offer you triple the current commodity market price per pound. This is exactly the kind of regenerative agriculture story our brand wants to sponsor. Margaret shook her hand, feeling the calluses on her own palms, a proud testament to the dirt she had fought so hard to save. The final check was staggering. It wasn't just enough to pay off the $2 million operational loan. It was enough to entirely eliminate the farm's debt, buy brand new, modern equipment, and leave a massive surplus in the bank. The day Margaret walked into the Oak Haven Agricultural Bank to settle the account, she didn't wear a suit. She wore her dusty work boots and faded denim jeans. Gregory Fisk sat behind his desk, looking pale and thoroughly defeated. The news of Jackson Carlos's federal indictment and impending bankruptcy had shattered Fisk's own power base. He knew his days as the local kingmaker were over. Margaret dropped the massive certified cashier's check onto Fisk's immaculate glass desk. "Account paid in full, Gregory," Margaret said, her voice echoing in the quiet bank. "And close the accounts. We're moving our operational capital to a credit union in the next county." Fisk stared at the check, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Margaret, Miss Dawson, please. We value your business. We can offer you incredible lines of credit for next season." Margaret leaned over the desk, her eyes locking onto his. "You didn't value our business when you tried to steal our land for your corporate master. Next season, I'm planting the other 200 acres of this farm with deep-root radishes and cover crops. I'm going to heal every inch of soil my grandfather broke, and you are going to sit here and watch." She turned and walked out of the bank, pushing through the heavy glass doors into the bright Kansas sunlight. The Dawson farm was alive again. The soil beneath the broken 60, once a suffocating tomb of hardpan, was now fractured, aerated, and teeming with returning microbial life. When the spring rains finally came next year, the water wouldn't run off. It would soak deep into the channels left by the rotting sunflower roots, recharging the earth. Margaret had bet everything on a single seed, defying the laughter, the sabotage, and the greed of an entire town. She had proven that sometimes the most powerful force on earth isn't a tractor, a chemical, or a bank account. It's a root, fighting its way through the dark, determined to find the light. Victory on the prairie is rarely absolute. It is usually just a brief intermission between storms. Margaret Dawson had delivered the cashier's check, watched Gregory Fisk turn the color of spoiled milk, and walked out of the Oak Haven Agricultural Bank feeling 10 feet tall. The California boutique oil company had wired the $2 million into a secure escrow account, pending the final, standard state agricultural export clearance. The massive harvest of high oleic sunflower seeds was safely locked inside 3 towering, corrugated steel silos on the north side of the Dawson property, waiting for the fleet of long-haul trucks to transport them westward. For 3 days, the Dawson farmhouse felt like a home again. Warren's chronic cough seemed to lessen, and the suffocating weight of generational failure had lifted from his shoulders. They spent their evening sketching out crop rotation schedules for the upcoming spring, planning to implement deep-root tillage radishes and nitrogen-fixing crimson clover across the remaining 200 acres. The hardpan was going to be shattered, field by field. But Jackson Carlos's empire, though decapitated by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency raids, had deep, parasitic roots of its own. Carlos had spent a decade buying politicians, regulators, and judges. He was facing federal prison, but his vindictive rage toward Margaret Dawson remained unchecked, and he still had loyal soldiers embedded in the state's bureaucracy. On a crisp Tuesday morning, just as the first massive 18-wheeler from the California Transport Company rolled onto the Dawson gravel driveway, a fleet of 3 white utility vehicles bearing the official seal of the Kansas Department of Agriculture blocked the gate. Their cherry-red light bars flashed ominously against the gray morning sky. Margaret stepped out of the barn, wiping grease from her hands with a shop rag. Her stomach plummeted. A tall, painfully thin man with perfectly parted hair and a clipboard stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 armed state troopers. He wore a crisp windbreaker and a completely emotionless expression. He did not look like a man who had ever worked a day in the dirt. "Margaret Dawson?" the man asked, his voice a flat, nasal monotone. "Yes. Who are you?" Margaret demanded, stepping between the man and the idling semi-truck. "Donovan Reed. Senior Export Compliance Inspector for the State Department of Agriculture, he said, holding up a laminated badge. He didn't wait for a handshake. He marched straight toward the 3 massive steel silos holding the Dawson harvest. I am officially issuing a stop movement and full quarantine order on this facility and its entire biological inventory. Warren came out onto the porch, his face immediately draining of color. Quarantine? On what grounds? The harvest is clean. We didn't use a single drop of unauthorized chemical fertilizer or pesticide. We did it all biologically. Donovan Reed stopped at the base of the first silo and signaled to his men. One of the troopers pulled out a roll of thick, bright red, tamper-evident tape and began slapping it across the massive steel discharge hatches of the silos. That is exactly the problem, Mr. Dawson, Reed said, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from his clipboard. We received an anonymous whistleblower report late last night. Your daughter's highly publicized phytoremediation strategy utilized hyper-aggressive taproots to penetrate the subsoil hardpan. While scientifically novel, it triggered an automatic environmental review. Historical topological records indicate that in the 1930s, this specific quadrant of Oakhaven County was heavily treated with lead arsenate, a common, highly toxic pesticide used before modern regulations. Margaret's jaw dropped. That was almost a century ago. That chemical bound to the topsoil and washed away generations ago. Not necessarily, Reed countered smoothly. Lead arsenate is a heavy metal compound. It leaches downward and becomes trapped beneath compacted layers of earth. Beneath the hardpan, your aggressive sunflower taproots, by your own admission, scavenged for nutrients directly in that trapped zone. Preliminary emergency soil core samples taken by our night crew from the county right-of-way, adjacent to your field, show catastrophic spikes in arsenic. He handed Margaret the papers. The numbers on the lab report were terrifying. Therefore, Reed continued, his voice dripping with bureaucratic finality, we have reason to believe your entire harvest is heavily contaminated with weaponized levels of heavy metals. These seeds are not agricultural commodities. They are toxic waste. If pressed into culinary oil, they could cause a mass casualty event. The quarantine stands until our state labs conduct a full mass spectrometry analysis of the seeds inside these silos. How long will that take? Margaret asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Given the current backlog, 6 to 8 weeks, Reed smiled thinly. And if the tests come back positive, the state will incinerate the crop at your expense, and the EPA will declare your farm a Superfund site. Good day, Miss Dawson. As the white trucks pulled away, leaving the red quarantine tape fluttering like fresh blood in the wind, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was the escrow officer at the credit union. The California buyer, legally obligated to avoid contaminated supply chains, had frozen the $2 million. If the quarantine wasn't lifted by the end of the month, the contract would be voided. Fisk's bank would repossess the farm under the missed deadline. Carlos hadn't just tried to steal the farm. From beyond his corporate grave, he was trying to salt the earth so the Dawsons could never grow anything again. Panic is a luxury a farmer cannot afford. Margaret had exactly 21 days before the California contract expired, and the Dawson farm was permanently foreclosed upon. She spent the first 48 hours locked in her office, surrounded by topographical maps, historical agricultural records, and hydrology charts. Reed's claim about lead arsenate in the 1930s wasn't a complete fabrication. It was used heavily in the region to fight off massive locust swarms, but Margaret knew the hydrology of her own land. The groundwater flow beneath the broken 60 ran south to north. The heavy metals should have been pushed away from her subsoil, not concentrated in it. She needed proof, and she couldn't rely on a state laboratory heavily influenced by Jackson Carlos's residual payroll. She needed an unimpeachable, independent scientific authority. She picked up the phone and called her former graduate advisor at the state university, Dr. Evelyn Brooks. Dr. Brooks was a legend in the field of forensic agronomy, a woman who had once testified before the United Nations on soil degradation. Margaret, Dr. Brooks's voice crackled over the line. I saw the news about the quarantine. Arsenic contamination? From Helianthus annuus? The biology doesn't support that level of bioaccumulation in the seeds, even if the subsoil was hot. I know, Margaret said, gripping the phone tight. But the state claims their emergency core samples tested positive. Dr. Brooks, I need a favor. A massive one. I need you to bring the university's mobile testing lab to Oakhaven. I need independent mass spectrometry done yesterday. 2 days later, a massive silver Airstream trailer customized into a state-of-the-art mobile laboratory rolled onto the Dawson farm. Dr. Brooks, a fierce woman with wild gray hair and a lab coat covered in dirt stains, marched out. For the next 3 days, Margaret and Dr. Brooks worked around the clock. They legally extracted tiny, representative samples of the sunflower seeds from the silos under the supervision of a neutral county judge. They also took over 50 deep soil core samples from every grid of the broken 60. At 2 a.m. on the 4th day, the computer monitors inside the Airstream lab chimed with the final results. Dr. Brooks pulled off her reading glasses, staring at the screen in disbelief. "Margaret, look at this." Margaret leaned over the console. The graphs representing arsenic and heavy metal concentrations in the sunflower seeds were flatlining. "Zero," Margaret breathed. "They're completely clean. The oil is pristine. But look at the soil cores." Dr. Brooks pointed to a second set of graphs. "Your soil is incredibly healthy, but there is a distinct, concentrated vein of heavy metals right at the southern property line, the exact spot where Donovan Reed's men took their emergency sample from the right-of-way." Margaret frowned. "But the groundwater flows south to north. If the poison is at the southern fence line, it didn't come from my farm." Dr. Brooks pulled up a digital map of the county. "What is directly south of that fence line, Margaret?" Margaret's eyes widened. "Jackson Carlos's main equipment depot, the site where he washes out his chemical sprayers and stores his industrial defoliants." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The arsenic wasn't from the 1930s. It was a byproduct of modern, illegal chemical dumping. Carlos's operation had been dumping toxic runoff directly into the drainage ditch that bordered the Dawson farm. Reed hadn't found historical poison. He had intentionally sampled Carlos's illegal toxic waste dump and blamed it on Margaret's sunflowers to force the quarantine. "We have the chemical signature," Dr. Brooks said, her eyes flashing with academic fury. "This specific isotopic ratio of arsenic matches modern industrial solvents, not 1930s pesticides. But Margaret, proving Reed intentionally sampled the wrong spot in a court of law will take months. You only have 14 days left on your contract." They needed a witness. They needed someone who saw Reed's men take the sample. That night, a torrential autumn rainstorm lashed the Kansas prairie. Margaret was sitting on the porch, watching the rain batter the red quarantine tape on her silos, when an old, battered pickup truck pulled into the driveway. The headlights flickered. Out stepped her Uncle Leonard. He looked a decade older than the last time Margaret had seen him. His face was gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. Since the night Margaret had caught him trying to destroy the water pump, Leonard had been treated like a ghost in Oakhaven. Carlos's empire had collapsed, leaving Leonard with his crippling debts and the crushing guilt of betraying his only family. He walked up the porch steps, rain dripping from his hat brim, holding a small black plastic rectangle. A USB drive. "Maggie," Leonard said, his voice raw and shaking. "I know you said you'd bury me if I ever came back on this land. I deserve that. But I can't let them do this to Warren. I can't let them take the farm." Margaret stood up, her arms crossed. "What is that, Leonard?" "You know I drive the county roads at night." Leonard swallowed hard. "Can't sleep anymore. Last Monday night, around 3 a.m., I was parked off the southern ridge near Carlos's old depot. I saw the state agricultural trucks pull up. I saw Donovan Reed." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Did you see where they took the dirt from?" "I didn't just see it, Maggie." Leonard held out the USB drive. "I've had a dashboard camera running in my truck ever since Carlos's thugs started threatening me last year." The camera was running. It caught Reed directing his men to dig directly into the center of Carlos's chemical drainage ditch, completely off your property line. They bagged it, slapped a label with your farm's coordinates on it, and drove away. Margaret took the drive, her hand trembling. It was the smoking gun. It was the final nail in the coffin of Jackson Carlos's corrupt legacy. "Why are you giving this to me, Leonard?" Margaret asked quietly. Leonard looked down at his muddy boots. "Because your grandfather built this farm with honor. Warren kept it alive with sweat, and I tried to kill it with cowardice. This won't fix what I did, but it might let me sleep." He turned and walked back out into the pouring rain. The next morning, Margaret did not go to the local courthouse. She drove 4 hours straight to the state capitol, accompanied by Dr. Evelyn Brooks, carrying the pristine lab results, the chemical isotopic breakdown of the toxic waste, and the high-definition dashcam video of Donovan Reed fabricating evidence. They bypassed the Department of Agriculture entirely, and walked straight into the office of the state attorney general. When the attorney general watched the video of his own senior inspector fabricating a toxic waste crisis, the bureaucratic machinery of the state ground to a violent halt. Warrants were issued within the hour. Donovan Reed was arrested at his desk before lunch, charged with evidence tampering, public corruption, and environmental fraud. By 3 p.m., the attorney general personally phoned the county sheriff in Oakhaven. Margaret drove back to the farm just as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in bruised purples and brilliant golds. A sheriff's cruiser was parked by the silos. The deputy was using a pocket knife to slice through the red quarantine tape, ripping it away from the steel hatches. The quarantine was dead. 3 days later, the escrow account cleared. $2 million flooded into the Dawson's new credit union account. The long-haul trucks backed up to the silos, and the golden harvest of the Broken 60 began its journey to California. The farm was completely debt-free, and Jackson Carlos's remaining corporate assets were seized by the EPA to pay for the massive environmental cleanup of his illegal chemical dumps. The war was over. The Roots had won. 2 years passed, bringing a profound and radical transformation to the agricultural landscape of Oakhaven, Kansas. The drought that had once threatened to turn the county into a dust bowl had finally broken, but the farmers didn't return to their old, destructive habits. They had seen the miracle of the Broken 60. The Dawson farm was no longer just a surviving homestead. It was the vibrant, beating heart of the newly formed Oakhaven Regenerative Cooperative. Margaret's initial gamble with the deep-rooted oilseed sunflowers had proven so financially and ecologically successful that she hadn't just planted the rest of her father's acreage. She had convinced 20 other struggling family farms to join her. Fields that had been trapped in the endless, soul-crushing cycle of chemically dependent corn were now a breathtaking patchwork of biodiversity. Sunflowers, deep tillage radishes, hairy vetch, and winter wheat rotated in a complex, carefully managed symphony of soil repair. Bobby Jenkins, the feed store manager who had once laughed Margaret out of the diner, was now the cooperative's chief logistical officer. He spent his days desperately trying to source enough organic cover crop seeds to meet the skyrocketing local demand. "I tell you what, Maggie," Bobby chuckled one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow as he loaded pallets of seed onto a flatbed. "If you had told me 3 years ago I'd be making a fortune selling weeds and flowers instead of synthetic nitrogen, I'd have committed you to the asylum myself. The soil tells us what it needs, Bobby." Margaret smiled, reviewing a shipping manifest. "We just finally decided to shut up and listen." The financial success of the boutique oil contract had given Margaret the leverage to make an even bolder move. She realized that shipping the raw seeds to California left too much profit on the table. If they wanted to truly secure the financial future of the county, they needed to own the means of production. On a bright Tuesday in early October, the entire town of Oakhaven gathered at the southern edge of the Dawson property, where Jackson Carlos's toxic equipment depot had once stood, now fully remediated and certified clean by the EPA. A massive, gleaming new structure had been erected. It was the Dawson Oakhaven Cold Press Extraction Facility. The building hummed with the sound of state-of-the-art, German-engineered cold presses. Inside, the massive harvest of the cooperative sunflowers was being crushed, yielding thousands of gallons of pure, golden, high oleic oil. The scent in the air was rich, nutty, and vibrant. By processing the oil locally, the cooperative had tripled their profit margins and created 30 new high-paying jobs for the town. A large red ribbon was stretched across the loading bay doors. Margaret stood at the center, holding an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. Beside her stood Warren, his posture straight, his eyes bright, wearing a brand new suit. He looked 20 years younger, and standing quietly in the back of the crowd, wearing a clean work shirt, was Uncle Leonard. Margaret had hired him 6 months ago to manage the facility's shipping fleet. Trust was a bridge that would take years to fully rebuild, but Leonard was putting in the work, one honest day at a time. The ghost of his betrayal was slowly being buried beneath the weight of his redemption. The mayor of Oakhaven tapped the microphone, the speakers squealing briefly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to celebrate not just a new business, but a new era for our county. We owe our survival to a young woman who looked at dead dirt and saw life, who looked at a powerful tyrant and refused to blink. I give you Margaret Dawson." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Margaret stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces, farmers, mechanics, teachers, all of whom had a stake in the cooperative. Beyond them, stretching out toward the horizon. The fields were a vibrant, healthy green, preparing for the winter frost. 2 years ago, this town laughed at me, Margaret said, her voice carrying clear and strong over the prairie wind. The crowd offered a few good-natured, sheepish chuckles. And I don't blame you. We were all terrified. We had been taught for generations that the only way to farm was to conquer the land, to force it to yield, to pump it full of chemicals until it surrendered. But the land isn't our enemy. It's our partner. She looked over at Warren, offering him a warm, steady smile. My father taught me that a farmer's greatest asset isn't their tractor, or their bank account, or even their sweat, Margaret continued. It's their roots. When the hard pan of life tries to stop you, when the drought tries to starve you, and when the bank tries to break you, you don't grow sideways. You dig deeper. You fracture the barrier. You find the hidden water. She grabbed the ceremonial scissors, the heavy metal gleaming in the sun. This facility isn't just a processing plant, Margaret declared, raising the scissors high. It is a monument to the fact that when we work with the earth, instead of against it, there is nothing we cannot grow. Welcome to the new Oak Haven. With a swift, decisive snip, she cut the red ribbon. The crowd roared, tossing their hats into the air. The massive loading doors of the facility rolled open, revealing the gleaming stainless steel vats of golden oil inside. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the townspeople headed home, Margaret and Warren walked out to the edge of the broken 60. The field had just been harvested a week prior, and the thick, sturdy stalks of the dead sunflowers had been mowed down, left to decompose and feed the thriving microbial life below the surface. The earth beneath their boots felt soft, spongy, and alive. Warren reached down, scooping up a handful of the dark, rich soil. He crumbled it in his calloused fingers, breathing in the deep, earthy scent of life. You know, Maggie, Warren said quietly, looking out over the moonlit fields. Your grandfather used to say that a man is only as good as the dirt he leaves behind for his children. I thought I had failed him. I thought I was leaving you a graveyard. Margaret put her arm around her father's shoulders, pulling him close. The wind rustled through the distant tree lines, a peaceful, enduring sound. You didn't leave me a graveyard, Dad, Margaret said softly, watching the stars emerge over the Kansas horizon. You gave me the dirt. I just had to figure out how to wake it up. The Dawson farm was no longer a tragedy written in dust and debt. It was a golden empire, anchored by roots that had broken the hardest earth, ready to stand against whatever storms the future might bring. We hope you were inspired by Margaret Dawson's incredible journey, from a mocked, indebted farmer to the leader of a thriving, multi-million-dollar agricultural revolution. The story of the Broken 60 proves that innovation, resilience, and a little bit of defiance can shatter even the hardest obstacles in life. If you love this deep dive into real-life farm drama, corporate takedowns, and the power of nature, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with friends who love an underdog story or anyone passionate about saving our environment. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming deep dives into the most fascinating true stories of survival and triumph. Leave a comment below. What's the biggest hard pan you've ever had to break through in your own life? See you in the next video.